dear friend of mine, and I also consider her a mentor. Julia Ebel, she's an author from Jamestown. As you can see, she's written all these books.
These, not those. These.
Yes, and Dr. Johnson's class is a children's literature class, and we just thought this would be really good exposure for our students that are going to be elementary school teachers to actually interact with a real children's author, just to have that interaction and ask questions and see how we can use literature in our teaching. And she said she would be able to come, and she's here. I'm glad that she's able to make it. She's very busy, so it's an honor that she took time aside to come and spend time with us.
I've been excited about this since the possibility came up, and you know what? I'm not where I'm going to see you unless I move a little. Yeah. We're going to have a conversation. Okay, I'm standing here. I might end up sitting down in a little bit and just looking at you. But I'm here to have a conversation with you. And I want to say to you first thing, if you have questions of me, I welcome those. Please ask. That goes for you and you and you and you, too. All of you. Please feel free to ask questions. I've been writing since 1987, at which point I was beginning to hone that skill. What brought me to writing first was reading with my own children and discovering that books at that point, this was largely at the beginning, 1976, my first one was born, and but from there on, realizing books were so much better than what they were when I was growing up. So much more colorful. The illustrations you see in books like Knots on a Counting Rope and Uncle Jed's Barbershop and Al Moon and Moses and Tops and Bottoms, all those, they're just so much richer, and the stories were richer, and so many of those address things that were certainly timely, and that tends to be a trend for children's literature as well as adult literature. Reading was fun with my children, and I don't regret a minute of that time that I spent doing that. As teachers, you'll have that chance to offer plenty of exposure to language in different ways with your own students and in time with your own children too. But I'm such an advocate of reading with children. I spent some years, about 15 years, teaching classes through Guilford Technical Community College on reading with children and different aspects of that. And it was a good excuse for me to gather a lot of good books that I liked and to read those and be prepared to share those. But around 1987 when I started on this was a transition point in my life. The second of my parents had died. My sons were old enough that they could, they were both into elementary school, one in elementary, one getting into middle school. And it was a good time for me to take on something new that I wanted to do, and that's what I did. I took a course on writing for children. I learned some things I didn't just pick up from reading, though reading is an important part of being preparation for writing. One of the things Dr. Johnson asked about, and he gave me some good questions here to think about, but the correlation between reading and written expression, in essence, a love of reading empowers written expression. And he asked about my thoughts on that. Oh, yes, indeed. Reading is important in getting a feel for that expression, but there were things I needed to have just pointed out to me too. And in time, practicing myself, writing about what was coming to mind to me. At first, I was writing about things that happened around me, things that just caught my attention. I've always loved nature. And so one time, I'll tell you a little story on the side here. One time, I was coming home with my husband from a visit with my brother one evening, and it had rained, really rained. And after the rain on a stretch of road, not a crowded stretch, but more rural. Here was a frog in the road, and it was a big frog, and I mean big. I had not seen one out that big. And so I said, stop. My husband's good, and he stopped. And I was going to move it off the road, and I figured it would just hop on over when I got out. Well, when I stopped and walked up to it, it didn't hop. So what would you do?
Pick it up.
I would too. I picked it up. And I thought, well, I'll just move it over. But then I thought, well, you know, we've got a creek in the backyard. I think I'll take it home with me. So I took it home with me. And it was dark. It wouldn't be any fun to take a frog out to the creek in the dark. So I decided to wait till morning. So I needed to do something with that frog. What would you do with it?
I put it in I caught a frog in a jar. I put it in a jar and filled with a hole in the top of it.
I bet you had a smaller frog than I had. Well, I didn't have a jar big enough for that. I have done things like that too in the past. But this one was not going to fit in a jar. What else could I do?
Put it in the box.
Well, yeah, I didn't come up with a great box. What else could I do? What? Dr. Johnson, what would you do with a frog?
I don't really like frogs.
Oh,
I
no.
don't want to touch them, but I would never hurt one.
Yeah,
But if I could find a box,
yeah.
something like that,
Yeah.
I won't have to touch the frog. I don't want to jump at the frog and make it move or something, so I would. I just don't.
I think I've got an answer back here.
Put it in your bathtub.
Well, that's what I did, of course, because I could put some water in there. Frogs like water. And my mother was not there to tell me not to, and my husband let me. So I did this, and we went on to bed, and the next morning, there he was in the bathtub. But an interesting thing was that the floor was all wet. Remember, this was a big frog. He'd been in and out during the night. Well, I did take him on out to the creek the next morning, and watched him as he hopped into the water. And several times over months later, I saw that frog. This was a long time ago, years later, when I was getting started with writing and looking for stories that I might play with and put down on paper. This thought came to mind, and of course, I couldn't take that experience and write it down just as it happened as an account of that to go to a magazine for children, because I was an adult and children want to read about children first of all. So I twisted it a bit, and the main character was a boy who had been to a baseball practice, and then on his way home well, you know how that went, but it was the boy this time. And so it was actually published in a magazine, Children's Playmate, out some years ago. But that's where stories start, with things that we have some exposure to in one way or another. I could tell you more. I could tell you about when I found caterpillars that were eating some herbs in my garden, and I brought them in and raised them to butterflies. And it was like an aquarium tank terrarium, and I had ordered butterfly caterpillars before, and I do these things. So I am a nature person. The interesting thing about that was one chrysalis did not open into the butterfly when it should have. And I concluded it was no good. I put this tank away in my basement for pretty close to the year, until the next spring when I decided I needed to order some caterpillars, because I was teaching a class for Guilford Technical Community College on children's books and nature. And so that's all the excuse I needed for that. And I left that one chrysalis in the container. Did I bring? Yes. this was the kind of butterfly it was. I love this book, the beautiful illustrations that bring this to life, the process of the growth of from egg to caterpillar through multiple stages of shedding, forming the chrysalis, and then emerging eventually as the butterfly. Beautiful wording by Joanne Ryder. Well, my chrysalis looked like this, hanging on the side of the container. It had a wood frame and with a little thread like a sling that held it up. And what I'd ordered was painted lady caterpillars, which hang from the top, like a little J. Have you seen this, son? Have you done this in school?
Yeah, in school.
Yes, it's a great experience to watch that. And if you're just really, really lucky, you're there when they come out, the butterflies come out. Well, anyway, I was in my class. I was down to one more chrysalis to open from the painted ladies. And here was this other one that had been in there for a year. And in the middle of class, I looked down, and here was a black and yellow butterfly, a swallowtail. But after almost a year, that had emerged. How could it have been living after all that time? But yet it was. So that's my resurrection story. Of course, I didn't tell that as an adult doing this. I told it from the viewpoint of a girl who had found these caterpillars and realized that they needed some protection, which I had realized too. There was a wasp getting one of mine and a spider getting another. And I did a little quick research and decided I had good butterflies in those caterpillars and I wanted to protect them. So I wrote it from the viewpoint of the girl. My writing, though, while I have been drawn to nature, a lot of the nature part of my writing has been in poetry. But the books, I really wanted to go toward the books and not just the magazine stories and articles. But the books were what lured me because I was already aware through things I had done reading with my children, coordinating a reading enrichment program at their school. I was already aware of what special things were in books, and I wanted to contribute to that. One book I did not get here with, one of my favorites, You're the Perfect Christmas Tree by Gloria Houston. Are you familiar with that? I remember hearing her speak at UNCG at a literature conference, children's literature conference, and she made the point that the mountain culture, that was not the central culture of America. When we look at multicultural, we can think about the obvious differences, but the mountain culture is a part of that difference as well. And she pointed out that when she grew up, there were not books that addressed her experience of growing up in the mountains. And so she grew up and wrote them. And somewhere along the way, from that comment from her, I thought I would like to contribute to that body of literature. I've long had a love of the mountains and mountain people. And as you'll see in things that I will share with you, I don't write about people who are rich and famous because, to tell you the honest truth, they don't impress me. But people who are real impress me. People who learn from difficult situations. People who draw from resources at hand. People who show their quiet but important strengths, not making a big to-do over it, but quietly accomplishing things. And so this is where I have focused in my writing. The first book that I wrote was this one. It was not the first one in print. It was actually the first one accepted by a publisher, but it took 7 years before that publisher actually had it in print and out. one could get very hungry in 7 years if depending upon an income from writing. Fortunately, I have a husband who had a good job, and I got to do the writing. But each of you have stories to tell, your personal stories, the stories of those who have come before you, the stories of those people in the circle around you who have shown you important things. But you have stories to tell yourself in one way or another. That doesn't mean you have to be an author, but I do encourage you to find your own way in your own time to share those stories. When I was a child, my grandmother, I remember telling me about when she was a child and took a calf for a walk on a road. She lived in Liberty, not far from here. People who have seen this book and know about cows and calves say that walking a calf is not the same thing as walking a cow. Are you shaking your head because you know something there?
We used to have cows. I live on a farm.
Yes, yes. Well, the folks who told me that had that experience as well, and they said that the cow knows where it's going, and the calf, you don't know what it's going to do necessarily. Well, in my grandmother's account, the calf ran, and she held onto the rope and didn't let go. And so she ended up flying back to the house behind that calf, barely touching ground. And her mother saw them coming back, and she said that her mother would laugh as she told about what she saw that day. And as I'm talking now, I can hear my grandmother's laughter in my memory, and that's a gift. I remember one day I was with my writer's critique group that I was in at the time. It's been several years ago, and there were 4 or 5 of us sitting around the table, and all of us had lost our parents to death. And I realized that it was at least 3, if not 4 of those said they could not call up the sound of their father's voice in their memory. And I was so saddened to realize that, because I could hear my father's voice. I can hear my mother's laughter, the sound of her voice, the feel of that. And I can hear my grandmother's laughter. That story, though, how many years later? I was a child when she told me that. So years later, I thought about, as I was working toward the idea of books, maybe I could do something with that story. Of course, at that point, I had no idea what I was really going to do with it except tell it. And so I worked on that. I didn't know enough to just tell it, because I really told you everything I knew. Wasn't the whole story, was it? And so, excuse me, I set out to the town where she had grown up. I stirred around, tried to get an image of the town, a sense of what it had looked like, what might have been there, anything else I could find out. I found a retired elementary teacher with a love of history and genealogy, and she could tell me more about my family heritage than I had anyone left to ask. Not only had my grandmother died prior to the time I started writing, but so had my mother, the link between us. I was out of stories and links to those stories. And so there was a part of me that was realizing that what I didn't hold on to was going to be gone too. So, drawing from what I could learn, I ended up writing the story, filling in the gaps with imagination, but also filling in first with information that I could come up with. The house is still standing where she lived, but I never visited there because she was in High Point. She'd been a teacher too, by the way, before my time. found out about names of people who were in that community and along that stretch of street where she had lived, thanks to that elementary teacher. I learned more about the depot, which was still in Liberty. It's been moved across the railroad track. It was very near her house, and the railroad went right in front of her house. I found out that there was a town well right toward the middle of town that had a trough, and so animals could stop and get a drink, or otherwise people could catch some water there too for themselves. I found out that my great-grandfather was the postmaster. Did I know that before? No, I didn't. And so I incorporated that into the story. I don't know where she walked. I don't know who and what she saw. But by starting with what I knew, I could build a story that gave an image of that town that reflected the people who were in it, including my great-grandfather, as well as my grandmother. The Reitzel store, well, the Reitzel store was her grandfather's store. It was in this stretch of buildings, which is still, with some renovations, still present in Liberty. The Mercantile was on the corner. Old photographs showed a step up to a recessed doorway. The illustrator, I was glad, paid attention to that. It doesn't change the story a bit, but it's just a little touch of that history. Well, as I really, even more, as I was working on it, I was seeing that connection to the history and the heritage and the family story. But also, I was realizing along the way, it was not about my story. It was about everybody's stories. And the fact that we all have stories to share, as do you, as do your families, as do those people who have touched your life in whatever way. So, while I was waiting for the publisher to get this one done, but let me pause for a moment. Any questions from you folks at this point?
How did you get did you have the idea for the illustrations? Usually the farmhouses are usually those white two-story houses.
Right, and this one was right in the middle of town.
Uh-huh.
And so Liberty had been a farming community that built up around the railroad track. And so the railroad went right through the middle of town, and her house was, you could throw a rock to the railroad track from her porch. So, but the house, I gave photographs to the publisher, who gave them to the illustrator whom she had chosen herself. And she paid attention to that. I passed along some pictures of, youngest ones I could come up with, of my grandmother, of my grandfather, great-grandfather, and my great-grandmother. Dr. Patterson, by the way, makes a little appearance. He really was the doctor at the time. But little touches of those were included. Images of the town, images of the post office. Tiny little building. It wasn't as big as this room. So, but it was a small community. By the way, in the story, I don't know what made the calf run. That's where the imagination came in, one of the places. But in the story, as she was walking back toward home, and everything was going nicely, and the sun was shining, and the flowers were blooming in her neighbor's yard. And she walks on, and then the train comes along, and she's right beside the railroad track, not where the calf would have been himself otherwise, but as the train made the noise coming into town, blowing the whistle and clicky-clacking, it set the calf in motion. So that mix of information and imagination. Ask me a question. Anybody?
You say you've been writing since 1987,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's like 30-something years. So, like, how many times between then and now have you found yourself at like writer's block or just like struggling to make something like creative that would catch the
Well, I would say that those are the times I'm not writing, but I have found after that first part, I've realized that my writing needed to be purposeful. I couldn't just write something for fluff. I couldn't just write something cutesy that I thought, well, maybe that'll sell. There will be those people who will tell you that I write for the money, but I'm not one of those. I have to have a real reason to share a story. I have to believe in my subjects. I have to love my subjects. And so in the first stage, I was coming up with ideas and trying things. But once I got to that point of the books, one thing was leading to another. And there are a lot of things I haven't written, but I've written the things that I have felt have been the most important for me to share. And even when I decided I have probably written my last book, I've written another one. So, and I'm very glad I did. I'll share a little bit about that with you in a moment then. Does that answer somewhat, at least? Okay. Yeah.
So I have a question.
Absolutely.
You know how you said the first book took 10 years?
Well, 7 years with a publisher. They were a new publisher. They had done one book. They had another one next in line, and mine was waiting for that one, and that one had some delays in it, and there was another one that came up they thought would be a quicker one to do, and so they did that one, and the financial part of that one had some flaws in it, and so on, and then they finally got mine done.
Did it get easier after that?
Oh, well, it did, but not really because of that particular publisher and that connection necessarily. I always had the feeling early on that once I get started with a publisher and could get something published, that will open the door. And I'm not sure that was entirely true. I did start sending things to the New York publishers, the big ones, with names that people would recognize. But what I realized was that it was the North Carolina presses that appreciated North Carolina stories. And it didn't take me long to realize it was the local stories that mattered to me the most, and the ones that I felt best prepared to tell. While I was waiting for Walking Ribbon to come off the press, I had thought about a lady I had met. Well, I'd met her twice, actually. Once in 1976, I was rather newly married. My husband's grandfather had died. We had gone to the funeral, and afterwards we went to the home of his sister, along with all the rest of the family, up near Boone, in the mountains, a mountain farm area. Addie Clausen's home. Addie Clausen, as I found out later, listening to her nieces, my mother-in-law and her sisters, she had been a mail carrier for a number of years. And in time, as I thought about that and having heard some comments from her, I thought, that might be an interesting story to pursue. Well, she was not living either. And so where would I go to find information about her? Help me out. If she's not living, that's where I would start. Absolutely. I went to a daughter first. She had 3 daughters, and in time I talked with all 3. One was especially helpful. But the first one gave me a lot of good information about experiences that she had. She started delivering mail in 1936, which was not a time that women were delivering mail on rural routes. They had picked up some of those responsibilities during World War I, but when the men came home, it was deemed their responsibility and their privilege of having the good jobs as well. And here, at a mountain farming community, probably the role of women was seen in a little different light than in cities. But well, women had done the jobs in the post office, but not delivering on the rural routes. She bought her car, first car she owned on Friday, the day right after she got her job. Learned to drive it over the weekend and drove it first of the week on mountain roads. But is that a car?
No.
Why do you suppose she's on the horse? Well, that's really her. This one is biography, short biography. But when I was working with Walking Ribbon, I could start with what I knew and turn it into a story and not be bound to make it exactly what it was, because I didn't know. But with this one, she was a real person. I was going to tell her story, so I had to tell it like it was. What happened was that car she bought, it was a Chevrolet, 1936. It wouldn't go on those roads, the roughest stretches of them. There were half a dozen stream crossings, and even the New River outside Boone had a low water crossing. Ruts and rocks and bumps, mud, not a good place for her car. So she would go where she could, and then she would meet her husband and get the horse and trade horse for car and go the rougher stretches until she got around enough that she could take her car the rest of the way. She would get him to come meet her again, and off she go, taking the mail she picked up along the way back to the post office. So, to tell her story, I found a publisher out of the Boone area. His wife was the head of the library at Appalachian State. His background was also in library, but he had several years earlier decided he wanted to publish. He had a dream. And he had to think about this one for a while, but concluded that this might just be worth telling. He said, I think this is one we need to do with photographs. And I thought, well, photographs are nice, but where am I going to get photographs of this lady who was delivering the mail? Who was out there taking photographs? And so I had to think outside the box. And I said, what if we fill in some places with sketches as well, where there was no picture? And he really didn't want to deal with royalty for a second person, so I traded some tutoring time for the person who did the sketches for me, and that worked out fine. Addie was a strong lady. She was determined. And when she got that job, the men who did not get it got a petition together to have her removed because she was a woman. Didn't work. She kept the job. But she was only given a temporary job because the postal officials thought she wouldn't last the whole time, through the winter. And they'd be replacing her. Well, 30 years later, they did have to replace her when she retired, but by then she was working full-time. And 3 times in 30 years, she was delayed in delivering. 2 snowstorms and a flood. Big snowstorms. This is, excuse me, I had a round with a bug. I am not ill now. I just have these lingering after effects with a cough, so my apologies. What is she doing in that picture? Can you tell?
The snow.
Mm-hmm. She's delivering the mail. But you see, the mailbox is down there because the snow is so deep. There was a copy of this picture that someone in her family had and shared with me, and it had a note on it that was 42 inches to the bottom of the mailbox. See the shovels? If you look really closely, you'll see that the snow actually comes up to here. You can see that little line where it was dug out. Who do you suppose dug those mailboxes out? Addie Clausen did. She had taken along her relief carrier with her that day to help, also a woman by that time in 1960. I, by the way, was in Guilford County, where I grew up, in 1960 in 4th grade. And I remember 3 Wednesdays in a row in March that we had snow. There will be people who will talk about that snow year all over the area. Well, the mountains had more than we had. And we had enough to go to school on Saturdays to make up for that. Oh, strong lady who wasn't afraid to tackle what came along. She always went with some basic equipment, a shovel, an axe. But that was not enough when a big tree had fallen across the road. And so she found the only person she could come up with nearby was a little lady, 4 feet something, I was told. And I met a niece of hers when I was out with my book one time at a conference. And she agreed, she verified that, yes, that was right. But these 2 ladies got out with that crosscut saw and got the tree out of the road. So Addie could go on with her route, and others could go through that street as well. Who are the people in your lives who have shown you that you can do something, who have empowered you and told you that you have reason to be confident? Who are those people? You think about that. Well, that was the sort of person I was looking at when I wrote about Addie Clausen. Any comments or questions before I go farther? Yeah.
Did you know about storytelling in your family growing up? Apart from the reading aloud, but just...
No. Reading aloud, yes. I remember, and that was a question you asked me too, I remember my mother reading at bedtime fairly often. I remember one set of books that had a number of stories in them. They were orange, but children's stories that we read from. And she took us to the library later. My first connection to the library was the bookmobile that stopped across the street from us. So I was in a rural area just outside Jamestown. I can still smell the bookmobile, the smell of the books in that vehicle. But it was a distinct, pleasant smell. And so that's where I had my hands on books first, those experiences. But storytelling, I did not hear a lot of storytelling. My father told a few things from some earlier times with him, but he was an only child. And so there were not those experiences of family, a group of his family sitting around talking about Mom and Daddy and growing up and things they'd done together. It just didn't happen. My mother had 2 brothers who were not nearby, and so those conversations weren't things I was privy to with them either. I would hear a little bit every now and then from my mother. I know she liked to play tennis. I know her father had a raccoon one time. But I don't know a lot of those stories. And I think that partly because of that, hearing my grandmother talk about taking the calf for a walk was such a gift, because it gave me a window into a time I had little opportunity to see. And it gave me an image of that person before me who had been an impish little girl, enough so that she would take that calf for a walk. But I saw her as a proper lady, an elementary teacher, retired, independent, living by herself at that point. And those were rare glimpses. So I am envious of families where stories are told. And that's a good lead into what I wanted to share next. After I'd written Addie Clausen, I was stirring around in the mountains there, around Boone, and I was talking with my publisher about a couple of ideas I had some interest in. One was looking into something that had a connection to herb gathering in the mountains. And the other was the storyteller Orville Hicks, who's a North Carolina Heritage Award winner now, not until after the book was written, but well known in the area as one who would tell the stories that were passed along. And it was that very process of passing along stories, what I had missed in my family, but was so much a part of his experience, that caught my attention. And so I made a point of, well, actually, I was working on this idea of the herb gathering, writing something about the herb gathering in some way. And I'd heard my mother-in-law and her sisters talk about gathering beadwood leaves on their mountain farm. And so I had asked some questions up at Appalachian State at the Cultural Collection, talked with the archivist there, and came up with a master's thesis that was done on herb gathering in western North Carolina. It was done about 1999. I read it, looked to see who had been interviewed, got out the phone book and made calls, reached 3 different people. One of them told me about gathering about 300 pounds of poison oak in a day. He would do that. I wouldn't do that. I don't know about you. But he said he would go to Boone Drug and get rust stalks, and he wouldn't be affected by it. It would be something that he would take for a couple of weeks before he did this. But he would sell that to Wilcox Drug Company. I don't know what they did, but they resold it to pharmaceuticals or whatever, and there was a use for it. And I talked with Orville Hicks, who talked with me on the phone for 45 minutes, someone I had never met, but he was willing, for whatever reason, to share with me his experiences in the herb gathering and growing up, and he talked about how his mother and brothers and sisters would go out and gather galax leaves and then sit on the porch to tie those into bunches of 25. The children would count out the 25, and the mother would tie them up, shiny round leaves that grow in the mountains. But she would tell stories as she did this. And it was daily fare for him. They might have been snapping beans or shelling peas or hoeing in the garden or churning buttermilk. And now Orville Hicks is a year younger than I am, but it was as if his world growing up was another generation from what I had known. But I was intrigued by this, and especially by the way the stories were a part of that. And so I ended up doing the biography of him. I posed the idea to my publisher, the one who did Addie Clausen. He knew who Orville Hicks was and thought that was a good idea. And so I pursued that idea. Talked with him, talked with Orville Hicks. I posed the idea, and I was honestly a little bit surprised at how easily he said yes. Come to find out, a couple of other people had offered that at some point, and he hadn't felt comfortable in saying yes with them. But he trusted me, and I'm so glad. I count him among my best friends. I've talked with him within the week. I usually talk with him about every week. But so genuine. Again, I don't look to those people who are rich and famous. He had an 8th grade education, but he has a gift in storytelling. He heard stories from his mother, who heard them from her father, who heard them from his father. And beyond that, I don't know the path of those stories, but those Jack tales and some of the others that he tells clearly have European roots. And there are people who study the folklore. Richard Chase was one of those who recorded people who were telling those stories, descendants of Council Harmon, who was Orville Hicks's great-grandfather. And the folklorists of this sort would record the stories, but they would look at the threads of story that go from this story to that telling, and on back to a common sort of a storyline. And what Richard Chase did, though, was once he had done all that recording and listening, he told the stories in Jack Tales and also in grandfather tales. But instead of telling it as the people told it, he told Richard Chase's version of those stories. How would you feel if you had told stories, or members of your community had told stories, and someone came along and told it in his voice, his way? You know, it wouldn't be the same, would it? And one thing I learned, well, I had probably passed the legal limit of fun working with Orville Hicks. He is just so genuine, and for all the stories he tells, there's no pretense in him. When I was working with this idea, I first was thinking about picture book. That's what I'd done, about how stories are passed along and his experience with that. But then I realized there was so much more to tell. And when I got to the point of really getting this into print with the same publisher who did Addie Clausen, the image of the book, we were down to that point. And I had communication with the person who was doing the book design and the layout. Have you run across the books by Russell Friedman? He did one on Lincoln, Eleanor Roosevelt. There was one that had to do with the civil rights era. But I really liked the way his books looked. Photographs that were not just always in the same place and always the same size. Some of them were in bleeds. The term bleed means it comes to the edge of the page. No white space there. But yet there's a lot of white space, isn't there? I like white space. It's just friendly, you know. And so I had shown this one to my book designer, and I was pleased with how he made use of what I saw as valuable in the images. A lot of white space. Photographs that were large, smaller at times, with not overwhelming captions. But after that was done, though, I realized that there were a lot of stories that needed to be told, and Orville was hearing a lot of people say, you need to get your stories down. And so I pitched that idea to the publisher, and so following Jack Tales and Mountain Yarns is told by Orville Hicks. Now, one of the things that I was realizing, I hinted at with you just a moment ago, is that I'm not from the mountains. So how was I going to tell Orville Hicks's stories with all due respect for this man who is the storyteller, not me? I'm just a vehicle for getting it onto the page. What would you do? How would you go about sharing someone's stories when you knew that that voice was important? What could you do?
Are you talking about as far as like when you were actually writing the stories out?
Mm-hmm. That's good.
I would try to make them as close to what was told to me while still making sure everything was, grammatically correct, but making the content as close to the story that was told.
All right, I like what you're saying. The way I accomplished that was I recorded his voice on all the stories that I told in the book. And I told is not really the way I should say that I shared through the book. Then I went back slowly, repeatedly, going through those stories, line by line, again and again and again on a line, to be sure I had his words, not mine. I had talked with Dr. Thomas McGowan at Appalachian State University, who had followed Orville for a number of years as well in the English department, and very much into folklore and the North Carolina Folklore Society. But he talked about I dialect and the way things look on the page to other people when you try to write with the quirky spellings that reflect dialect. And my conclusion was I wasn't going there. I was not going to use those quirky spellings that made it sound like I thought maybe it sounded when Orville spoke it. I used the traditional spellings. I dealt with pronunciations and a glossary at the back. Now something like taters, holler, I did use those. That's pretty commonly understood. But if, for example, I wrote blar in a story, what would I be saying? Blar. Blar. It sounds like B-L-A-R. I figured a fourth grader wouldn't get it. I figured it might also not, those spellings could look demeaning to my subject. And so I dealt with those in the back. Orville would say that that rabbit ran down to the blar patch. Briar. Briar, yes. The fourth grader would probably go right past and not get the message. You'd figure it out, but not the younger readers. And I wanted them to be able to read this as well as adults. And so, so that's what I did. There were plenty of times I went through a line on my recorder a dozen times to be sure I had it right. I made sure Orville read it several times along the way. I read it to it, and I would say, Orville, have I got it right? Have I got it right? Because I wanted it to be his. I wanted him to feel absolutely confident that I had told his story in his words. And we've accomplished that together, working together. So, questions from you at this point? Anything?
Who's your audience? Like, what age group? Do you have a certain age group that you're thinking about when you're
Well,
writing?
that's a very good question. You know, I found myself, first of all, thinking about young readers, about children, and making things accessible to children. But a lesson I learned early on is that it's the adults who share the books with children first. And so I needed to speak to them also. And working with Addie Clausen, I've sold probably about as many of these to adults as to children, because there are those who have strong women in their families or friends who are strong women or who have been associated with the Postal Service. But making those connections with the adults was also important. And yet the voice I needed to be sure would reach elementary to middle school age readers in anything that I have done.
Have some of them been used in the classroom?
Yes, Addie Clausen has, Walking Ribbon has, the Picture Man has quite a bit. This one.
In social studies or other times?
Oh, in different ways. Linking to social studies, yes. You could go to a science link on this one with light and lenses and cameras. But Orville Hicks has been, Jack Tales, The Mountain Yarns has been quite a bit. So, yes. Yes?
Would you expound from the elementary teacher perspective? I talk to my students about a narrative is only as good as it is read. So when has he used inflection? Would you
Yes.
expound on
That's a very good point. And this was a timely question in what I'm saying here too. Oh, as I thought about telling the Jack Tales and other tales that Orville has told in ways that would accomplish that, I realized that yes, I needed to have his words, not just some telling out of my head that I thought sounded proper, but I needed his voice. When you look at that page at a distance, you might think I'm trying to write poetry. I'm not. What I'm doing is letting the line breaks be the runs and pauses in his speech. And I'd explained that in the introduction to the book. Oh, and so I remember when this one was in process, pretty close to done, I had a tutoring student with me. She had actually been born in Korea, was there until she was about 4 years old, and then had come to America. She was a 9th grader. But I let her read some of this, and I was interested in how she would read it. And I was pleased that she got it. She could hear that. But there are ways that we can give signals to our readers, but it really comes down to the reader to bring that out too, you know, in terms of the expression that conveys the story as it was intended to. But I think that was a very good point there.
In addition to checking the students, that every effective teacher is an actor, an actress. And that's one has to come out of character sometimes to really bring the narrative alive. Would you expand on that?
Yes, I think that, well, all these books, excuse me again, these books that I love, there are ones that are told slowly, that need the white space to say slow down and hear this. There are ones that need to be told with a quickened pace, for example, and the voice that the reader gives helps to tell the story. It's not just the words, but it's the feel of the story. And I think first part of that is that in the presentation of it, we hope to give those clues on how that needs to be read. Stepping aside from this, I want to mention a couple of other things. I have loved working with poetry, in particular free verse poetry. Some years ago, when Out of the Dust was chosen as the Newbery Medal winner, late 90s, I read this, The Stories of a Girl in the Dust Bowl, 1929, on the family farm where it is so hard to grow anything. Yeah, actually, this gets into the 30s. But the mother dies from an accident at the wood stove when she was burned and ultimately died. That left the father, the girl, and a young boy. And the story is told with free verse. And look at all that white space. When you see a lot of white space, what does that tell you to do? Pause, pay attention, slow down. And one poem, this one, look how short that is. The girl is just wanting to be out of the dust because the dust was everywhere. It was too dry to grow things. Her father would struggle and struggle to make this happen, and it's hard. The dust would come in through the cracks you didn't even see, and the house would be all over. And here, the title of the poem is Broken Promise, the date being March 1935. It rained a little everywhere but here. It's not just the words, but the white space that tell you that story. And I felt that if that had been told in paragraphs of information, I don't think it could have been any more effective in creating that picture than this that makes us slow down and hear the hurt, the heartbreak that she feels. Yes.
You
Yes.
have study guides for some of your books?
All of my books have study guides on my website.
So
So
that works out good for the classroom teacher.
yes, yes. Mhm.
Lesson
They can get
plan.
to those. Yes.
Okay. Do you ever? I haven't read one of the study guides yet, but
Yes.
do you break it down where students that are not reading on grade level, where they would be able to?
What I have tried to do, I haven't tried to make it a specific grade level, but because I realize that these are books that can be used across curriculum,
Yeah.
and they can be used at different grade levels. And so there I let the teachers figure out how to make these ideas fit with their own level. Next Friday, I'm going to Christine Green Education Center in Jamestown, which is the autistic school, the upper level autistic school. And they have been using the Picture Man for a series of lessons. And this is a different group.
Yeah.
But they started with a study guide on gathering some ideas on things to do with this too. And looking at photography, but I'm excited about going to see what they have done with this. But yet, this one's been used as a One School, One Book project across grade levels. Looking at, more in depth, the idea of photography to keep our stories, and the photography itself. Usually when I go to a school, and I'm going to talk about this, and I'll take an old camera with the bellows that unfolds like that too. But the farm life in which this is set, I'll give you a quick look here. Talking about the sound of a voice and lines and poetry. Working with poetry certainly gave me a part of the voice of this story. I haven't tried to make it poetry, and yet the repetition of sounds or repetition of phrases at a point or two helped to do that. The Picture Man comes along offering to take a picture. In the first half of the 1900s, people didn't all have cameras. And it was really special if a picture man would come along and offer to take a picture. In towns, they may have come with a pony or a go-kart. I have some pictures of my mother, her two brothers, and their mother, my grandmother, Maggie of the story, Walking Ribbon. And there's a bird cage, but there's several poses with that. That was a picture man. But in the rural areas, this is the part that really intrigues me most. It was where the people were. The pictures would look like this. Informal, and yet there's a formality. People would often dress up when they knew the picture man was going to take their picture. But yet they were where they lived, where they would be. There's a picture, let's see, this family. Just come around. They're dressed up, aren't they? But look at the background. I'm coming. Oh, well, thank you for coming. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Yeah. Oh, as you look at the picture, they're dressed up. They could have gone to the studio and had a nice picture, but when you look at the whole picture, there's a whole other story behind them in the background. This is a tiny little picture on the front of that girl. She's sitting in the road. It's a mountain road, very rural. If a car were coming up that road, you'd know it because of the sound. And this intrigued me. Why was she sitting in the road? But yet, that tells part of her story. We know something about where she lives. It's not uptown Greensboro. Not bad. But it invites us to think further. The idea of the voice that we get from the guides with the words. How is my time?
2 more minutes.
2 more minutes, is that it? Oh my goodness. How much?
89, 99, 10, 15. So I guess 7 more minutes for class of picture.
Okay, oh wow. Okay, I have worked with poetry to tell a story. The one that I was headed toward when I met Orville Hicks was this, Dresses, Dreams, and Beadwood Leaves. Beadwood leaf being witch hazel. You may have it in your bathroom cabinet, I do. But people in the mountains have gathered this and sold it to be used in whatever way, be resold for making the liquid that you could buy in a bottle that looks like a bottle of alcohol. But people use it as an astringent for skin irritations, bug bites. I do that. But I was also interested in telling this about looking at that experience of girls on a farm, whether it was in the mountains or otherwise. They would have probably been wearing feed sack dresses. Have you seen feed sacks before? These are feed sacks. You can see even on some, this is a little stitch line. Yeah. And it would have been folded in the middle like this, filled up with whatever feed for animals. Flour and sugar also were packaged in this. And this would have been maybe around the 20s up into the early 50s probably. But you're welcome to see how this feels. Put your hands on it. But these weren't thrown away. They were made into dresses and curtains and aprons and small pieces made quilts, you name it. But looking at the story here of a girl who, for a couple of good reasons, decided she wanted a store-bought dress. Not that she didn't appreciate the feast-sack dresses that her mother made, but a couple of things, a couple of good reasons inspired that. But looking at a way to tell the story, I loved working with the poetry. Okay, Dr. Johnson, you had asked about poems. It appears that Mama's Wreath is a collection of poems. Do you find poetry writing more difficult to pen than traditional literary works? And this one is Mama's Wreath, which uses that same format. It's the series of the poems that tells the story, not just individual poems. I loved working with that. In truth, I'm really a person of few words. If you put me in a group, a social group, I'll be the quiet one. But I found it honestly freeing to be able to not say everything, but to say what was what I wanted to say, and let the white space slow us down to pay attention, and let every line have something of a nugget of the story, of the message in it. Let me just catch a snippet of this. I'm thinking about the nurse who came to school back in winter. We had chicken pox all over the school. So the county sent her to check on us. She spoke to me in a soft voice, so kind and yet so sure of herself. Her warm hand touched my shoulder. I wonder if she noticed when I touched her ironed white dress. I wonder if I could learn to be a nurse with a soft voice, a gentle hand, and an ironed white dress. If I had tried to do this in some standard meter with rhyme, I couldn't have accomplished this. But this was the path I took with the free verse, the short lines. Seeing out of the dust, seeing work by Bird Baylor years earlier, and seeing how she had used short lines, shorter than mine for the most part, in a couple of books, was just an inspiration to me. Expand on the need to have a highly talented illustrator. It certainly helps. Carol Boston Weatherford's.
That's what caught my interest before I actually read the story of my
Yes,
child, was the illustration.
absolutely. Carol Weatherford was one in my writer's critique group, but I remember her pointing out one day, we were sitting down at her house in High Point, this picture. The text, the font, one is the narrator's, one is Harriet Tubman's voice, the capitals are God. And in this one, here she is, and God's voice just encircling her. But beautifully done. Kadir Nelson did beautiful, beautiful work on this. James Ransom is just a gem with Uncle Jed's Barbershop. I wanted to be out listening for an owl at night when I read this. Jane Yolen. Simpler story here, Kevin Hinckus. Bright and colorful. My favorite, different looks at birds. My favorite page, though, I love this one. If their tails could make marks in the sky. Or this, when the birds all sit in a tree and all at once looks as if the tree said, surprise. Ask me another quick question.
I wanted to basically reemphasize some things that we talked about in class.
Yes.
You alluded to the oral tradition, which I was
Yes.
so glad that you did. And
Yes.
just yesterday, I, in another class that's not children's literature related, I had my students to write, I let them tell me, what was that song yesterday dealing with the poem as well, the poetry that I had you all to write?
It was we had to write a 12-line poem about divorce,
Oh,
and from the
Yeah.
perspective of the child.
yes. I've just been reading the Guilford County Poet Laureate, High School Poet Laureate submissions. I'm the final judge for that. I'm going to be delivering those to Grimsley after I leave here today. Finally, it's hard. But this kind of topic was coming up repeatedly. It's clear that there is a need for expression of these concerns. Suicide, self-harm, anxiety and depression, the effects of divorce. These came up more than once in the 140 or 50 poems I read. But it was clear that there was a need for expression of tough things.
In addition, I had them to write individual narratives on certain themes.
Yes, I
And
like
what are
it.
some of the things that you got to write about? Give me one, Margaret.
Yes, yes. And I know that's important as one who at 35 was out of generations before me. I
Okay,
know
sure.
how important that is to deal with.
We share what you wrote about?
I wrote about my great-grandfather who passed away 2 years,
Oh,
3 years now.
yes,
It was hard writing it because I miss him still, and I still think about him a lot. So
yes.
just writing the paper, I was like crying while I was writing it. 'Cause
I bet you were.
talked about it.
I bet you were. I would be too.
Yeah, and I haven't really talked about him and expressed how I feel, so writing the paper was kind of like hard. It took me back, and I had to like call my dad because him and my dad were very close. So
Yeah.
talking to my dad about it, he was like, just write it. Just tell him how you feel. And I'm like, Dad, it's not that
Yes.
easy. Like, you can do it without crying, but it's harder for me.
It's okay to cry. Yeah, very helpful at times. I remember not too many years ago, I wrote about the grandfather I didn't know either of my grandfathers. They'd both gone before me. But I have a picture of him standing beside my grandmother, who I didn't know either because she died the year before I was born. And it shows him from the neck down, shows her. And the mule, John, is beside them, and the dog, Trixie, beside. I knew their names because my dad told me. But his head was missing. And what I knew was that my dad said he was going on 7 feet. So he was very tall. And it seemed somehow appropriate that picture did not show all of him. But you know, there is still a part of me that grieves for not having that lap to sit in as a little girl and those stories to hear from him. You had the privilege of hearing from your great-grandfather, and that was a special gift. And so the reason it hurts is because it matters. The reason for those tears is because those lives have mattered. Yeah.
Another thing was Sparkless Days. Get it right on.
The best gift that we received.
Oh, okay. So what did you pick?
I wrote about the time that I graduated and my mom, as like a graduation trip, she took me to California, which was a place I always wanted to go.
Mm.
So that was really great to write about because it brought me back with the emotions of, it was a surprise, so I was really surprised that I had the trip that I always wanted to go, so it was,
Mhm. My first window to California was about 12 years ago after my son and daughter-in-law moved there. So you got there much earlier than I did. It was an interesting place. I'm glad they're closer now.
The last thing as well comes on another thing that you had to write about.
We had to write about our first grade, 6th grade, and 12th grade teachers.
Yes.
Yeah. Writing like 3 different papers.
Mm-hmm.
About that experience. Share
fun, especially for first grade and sixth grade, because 12th grade is more recent for us. But reflecting back onto first grade and sixth grade, when I was writing about those teachers, it made me realize that those teachers, it was really funny how like you picked those grades and those were the teachers that actually were influenced me to want to become a teacher. So it was like
Right was.
it was fun
Yeah.
to recall back on like the little quirky stuff or like their personalities and stuff. So.
And many times in the process of writing, you find what you really wanted to write about in it, but you didn't know in the beginning. And I remember one time speaking to a group, and there was one fellow who, this was a genealogy group, a fellow spoke to me. I could tell he was pretty academic, and he had asked a question about, well, do you use an outline when you're writing? And I said, well, honestly, I don't. I may have some idea of where I'm going, but those paths develop as I'm going to. A basic idea is important, but you know, as you were writing, I expect for all of you that you found that you were coming to things you really hadn't been thinking about in the beginning. And we need to be open to those and see where those are leading us to. So I'm so glad you all are doing this sort of writing too, and connecting to those things that have shaped your lives. This is important. Yeah.
Can we share our guest speaker some love?
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much.
Well,
for
you're
sharing your
welcome.
experience with my
And
students.
if anyone has other questions of me, I know some of you probably need to head on to another class or something, but I'm here. So would be happy to respond to those.
Okay, one more
Is that
time,
good?
please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So,
I know I want to write a children's book, but I just don't know what I want it to be about. And I guess when you came today and talked about how you wrote about what was kind of important to you, that kind of spoke to me. So that now I know when I go and write my book, I don't want it to be like a fluff. I want it to have some kind of meaning to the readers and to me. So, but I still don't know what I want to write about. So,
and that's something that you'll find as you try. It certainly happened that way for me. You know, I tried some things and found those things I enjoyed, but in the process, I found the ones that were really important to me to write. And you will too. And you will too. But start with what you love.
okay.
Start with what you love. Start with what matters to you.
What was the first, I know you talked about the first book that was published, but
Yeah.
what was the first book that you wrote?
Of the ones that became books, Walking Ribbon was the first one that I wrote. Addie Clausen was the first one that was in print. But I had written a number of stories. Some of those went into magazines, and a lot of them went into files. And now I pull those out and when it's the right time and share them with my grandchildren, which is fun too. So there are a lot of reasons for writing. It's not all for publication.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah.
I know I might want to think about writing a book, but I know it's just, I have a lot of stories to tell. Like, a lot whenever I lived in Germany and how my experience there.
So you lived in Germany?
Yes,
Wow.
my dad's military, so I
Yes.
moved all over.
So you speak German?
9. It's a little bit. I lost it on the way coming, like, I learned a lot while I was there because we lived there for 4 years, but as we were coming back, I kind of lost speaking German. So, but I know I want to probably talk about that and how my experience was, but I don't know how to go about it because I have so many stories because we went all over.
I actually have a little German in one of my books. About Hansi and the Iceman. Hansi, obviously German, nickname for John, Johannes. But that started with my father-in-law, Hansi, to his family when he was growing up, and ice was delivered. But the idea of the German, his grandmother, this was in America, though his parents had come when they were young, but one of his sets of grandparents never really learned the English. But in the story, the grandmother, who had the icebox, said some things in German that the boy translated. But isn't this so true, that it's the young ones who come to a new place who learn the language? Yeah. But I wonder what you could do, and it might have a few sprinklings of German in it,
That's what I was
too.
thinking
Yeah,
too.
yes. I bet so, yeah. Yes, and you know, as I said, the writing that we do, find those places that maybe you can share it, and it might be a gift to someone in your family, for starters. You know, if my grandchildren gave me something they wrote, you can be assured I'll be thrilled. If my sons gave me something they wrote, I would be thrilled. But that's a good place to start. Yeah. I'm not going to put you on the spot.
I'm not sure. I wouldn't know what to write about.
Yeah.
It would have to take time.
Mhm.
It would have to come to me.
Yeah. One of the things that I write about a good bit is nature, and I do that through poetry. I've done a lot of little poems, snapshots, just snapshots, because to me, nature is really soothing. And I would not thrive uptown anywhere. I need nature around me. I need flowers. I need to be able to see the sky. I need to be able to put my feet on the ground. And so I'm very happy wandering in the woods. Actually, let me share real quickly a poem. I won't go far with this, but sometimes it's just a little teeny, tiny picture. This one, riding down the road, black cows in a white field huddle, holding warmth as snow falls. And I just like the look of those cows and their very patient tolerance of the snow that was falling on them. Of course, I would have liked to have been out in the snow too. But this was just fun. But you know, sometimes we start with something small, but sometimes those things that we bend with small grow into something else. This one though, it's upside down, and I've had fun with this. This was in Cricket magazine. But earth stars, first here, then there, fireflies blink, blink, blink their lights and rise beyond the highest trees to become stars. But just the image, just an image. Images of people. Images of things that are around you. Start with something small. Sometimes I've realized that the things I may have written as a little short essay sort of writing years ago was really about writing fewer words in a poem, or about taking that into some other writing later. One of the books I didn't talk about, Max Woody, Chairmaker, I met a man several years ago who made chairs the traditional way. No nails, no glue. He'd make yours fit you, and he'd make yours fit you. And he'd done that since 1950, and did it until about 3 years ago when he could no longer stand at the lathe to turn the wood. And I just, the day I met him, I wrote a couple of poems, snapshots. And what sort of snapshots would you write? You know, little things, too. And see where they go. It had turned into a book, so biographical.
Do you add, like you had that frog story?
Yeah.
How do you embellish or add characteristics to these
Mm.
animals that would create like a sort of imaginative, adventurous situation for a young child?
Right. Well, first of all, that was done a long time ago, and I would probably do some things a little differently now than I did then. But certainly, I would want to put the tactile part in this. Now, how would it feel? How would it, you know, some visual descriptions that are woven in as the child would perceive that. And so it was important, it would be important to do that rather than just generally tell what happened, because you want that reader to have the feel of this. Yeah. So one of the things that I find myself, I mentioned working with the poetry and the poets laureate for Guilford County High Schools, and one of the things that I'm finding myself telling them is to use those concrete nouns, but remember that the real centerpiece of this is the verbs, those active verbs. Yeah. I love that one too. Yeah, yeah.
Maybe you share what you all did with this book. What did I have you all to do with it?
Go ahead. Oh, I was with this, no, we don't do it. Well, with this book, it doesn't have any words in it, it's a
No.
picture book.
I have that book at my house too.
So
We got the same good books.
the assignment was to basically write the book. So
Yeah.
we had to do the narrative part to go. So we just went ahead and with each picture, kind of just did like the narrative, and yeah, it was a group assignment.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I do. I kind of do. So we talked about the frogs.
Yeah.
Because, so-
Did you describe them?
Yeah, we kind of
a bit?
made it like extra, I guess. We made the frogs magical, right? They were magical frogs because
I think they're pretty magical.
I think we said
They're
something
fine.
about the frogs eating the turtle because it disappeared, and then they were flying. We talked about they flew into where is it? The old lady's house.
Mhm. The television. They're getting there. There's the house. Yeah, come
There we
in.
go. Yeah, we talked about this, and we talked about the cat creeping in the corner. We gave the cat a name. We gave the old lady a name, the old man a name. And then the old man makes, not old, he's not old, but he makes another appearance, I think, at the end of the book. So, where is he? Right there?
Yeah, still in his pajamas.
Yeah, so it was important to give him a name because he made an appearance, so we can kind of connect that back there, like, oh, he was a witness.
And the dog
Yeah, the dog too.
who encountered these earlier.
And then we just said, something like, we wonder what will happen to the town next because of the flying pigs, so.
And this one, Caldecott recognition without words, but Caldecott medal being given to the most distinguished picture book for children in the year. But the focus is on the illustration and telling those stories. And illustrations, this is illustration, but in other things, you may find that the illustrator tells a little bit of an angle that you're not going to read in the words. Most times someone else is chosen to be the illustrator rather than the author, because most authors write and illustrators illustrate. But it's a nice mix when someone can tell a story and illustrate it as well. But even when someone is illustrating someone else's story, that little extra something that becomes a part of that, a little quiet something. I was glad with Walking Ribbon that the first page showed the girl holding violets in her hand. It was before the story began, but she was picking them. And the story began when she was running toward the barn. She had a handful of violets she'd picked for her mother. But there was nothing that told in the story about her picking them specifically, and here was that image. But that took it, even before the story began, that illustration gave that insight. By the way, why would I think about putting that in the beginning of a story? Because I pick violets every year of my life since probably at least by the time I was 2. I love picking violets in the spring. And I have violets in my yard. I'll be out picking when the mud goes away. But those things that happen way back in your life are a part of who you are. And those you never know where they'll pop out and be of value to you, in ways you had no expectation. I certainly didn't dream of being a writer as I grew up. But it was those points of change in my life. When I ran out of parents, ran out of family there close by. And so that I started looking in that direction, but I was reaching back. Yeah. Good?
Yes, thank you for coming and talking to us.
I've enjoyed being here. Enjoyed it very much.